Hello, Y11. I'm just going to be talking you through this session. We'll be having a look at the narrative thread. So, what I'm going to be having a look at is how to effectively create that and then how to use it in your creative writing because it is a really, really effective tool to use. And it just gives your story a bit more structure and a little bit more focus and avoids you kind of going off on tangents and things like that. So if you just need a reminder, this is the creative writing framework, and you'll notice I've highlighted a certain bit in blue. So paragraph 1 says that you need to focus on one small detail to begin with, and then keep returning to that as your narrative thread. And then as you flow through, you'll notice that there's these little needle and threads that are just after each of the arrows barring the first. And that's essentially showing you that you should have some sort of reference as you go through each paragraph to your narrative thread throughout. So you start off with that small detail and just slightly reference it, and you can even bookend your story by beginning and ending with your narrative thread. So it should exist throughout to give your story this kind of circular structure to it. And the best way I can kind of describe the narrative thread is to kind of make you think about it as almost a game of Where's Wally. So I've said that exactly like Where's Wally, it should always exist. Your narrative thread should always exist in your story, no matter how busy it might get in your story. So in Where's Wally, he's always in the picture. Somewhere we know exactly that he is there and that you need to find him. Once you've shown your narrative thread, i.e., once you've found Wally in the picture, it should always be really, really obvious as well. So it's kind of like when you have gone through a Where's Wally book and you found him once, if you open that book up straight away, your eyes go straight to him. So that's the same idea. Once you've pointed out in that opening paragraph what your narrative thread is, then you need to continue to return to that and make it a little bit obvious that it's constantly there and really, really central to your story. And then again, no matter what you write about or where you decide to take your story, whatever direction, your narrative thread must always exist. So, for example, in this really, really busy picture that I've got on screen, as busy as that might be, Wally still exists in that picture somewhere. So it's exactly the same with your narrative thread. It should always be there. Sometimes it might be quite small and hard to see, whereas other times it should be really, really obvious. So what you need to think about is with your creative writing, and this is something that we've all kind of noticed, is that quite a few people try and have this huge expansive story that they're trying to create, this with zombies and explosions or these kind of movie pieces, so to speak. A lot of people are trying to write a big long movie piece that you'd maybe sit down in the cinema and watch, and they're trying to write that in this really, really short frame of time. So I just thought it's really, really helpful to remind you all that you do only have 45 minutes to write up your creative writing piece. And therefore, in that time, it is totally impossible to try and write anything that kind of spans different worlds or goes over the top, that's got lots of death and people getting killed, caught, committing a crime and being caught for it. There's really just not that time scale to try and build that sort of story. So if you're trying to think about including explosions or car chases or murders, anything that kind of extreme, there really isn't enough time to do that. So what we all would like you to do is really focus on detail rather than trying to come up with too much plot. Because if you focus in on those details, that's where you're going to get the extra marks for the different techniques, the way you describe different scenes, different people, different situations. And it just gives you an opportunity to really show off a vast vocabulary rather than worrying about having to kind of ram rush through this really long story that you've got in your head. So it's definitely better to think small and detailed rather than trying to think of this big extreme story that could win you any rating prizes and things like that. So just for scale, just to give people an idea of what I'm talking about, I've picked out 3 different really, really famous books that did take quite some time to write. So J.R.R. Tolkien was incredibly famous for writing The Lord of the Rings. Yes, it was 3 separate books. However, it did take him 16 years to write those 3 books. So he certainly would not be able to write one of them in one of these exams, which is the sort of scale some people are looking at the minute. Margaret Mitchell, who wrote a very, very famous novel turned film as well called Gone with the Wind, that took her 10 years to write. And then J.K. Rowling, very famous person I would assume most people have heard of. It took her 6 years to write Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone. If anyone has read it or has gone back to read it recently, you might notice that the story is really targeted towards younger children and that the language can be quite basic at times, but even still, that big expansive story, just the first novel itself, took 6 years to write. You have not got time to try and create anything similar to that, which is why the best way to think about it is think about it as just a small photograph, a small moment in time that you're describing from a much larger picture. You're just giving us a small glimpse into a much bigger story. So as I showed you on the first slide then, your first paragraph should be focusing on this small detail that you're going to pick out to become your narrative thread. And when I say small detail, I do mean something quite small. So you need to think about something that's your character can potentially hold onto, something that's really personal to them, that means something to them, but is the sort of thing that nobody else would potentially notice. So you're going to pick out this detail, and that's going to continue to bleed through into your other paragraphs and keep getting returned to. So these are just some examples that I've thought of that could be quite nice because they are quite small and each of them could have a different personal meaning. So we've got this kind of old teddy bear that a character could have. You've got this old coin that could have been handed down or something like that. A medal that could have come from a relative or somebody could have earned themselves. Something slightly strange is something like half a best friend necklace that maybe somebody has. Maybe they don't talk to that friend anymore, or something's happened to that friend, or they've had a falling out. Or you could have something like just a little photograph that they can have a hold of or keep with them at different points in time. If you think about some people who keep photographs of loved ones in their purses or wallets, so any of those sort of small things, they're enough to hide away and not create a big story out of, but they still can exist in a kind of microscopic way in the story, and you can keep kind of glancing your eye across through your writing to remind people that it's there. So they're just some ideas for you to think about. Now, I've included this photograph. I will say that you won't get anything in your assessments. Never tend to get these kind of big, exciting pictures like this, but I just thought I would give everyone plenty to work with. So for one of the questions, you'll have a choice of either picking out a scenario that's been given to you, or you can use the pictures that you'll be given in your assessments as a guide or to inspire you a little bit. And what I want you to do is just, once I've finished speaking, pause the video just for a couple of minutes and have a look closely at this picture. And then what I want you to do is see if you can pick out 5 different small details that you could potentially pick out as being your narrative thread and the starting point of your story that you can keep returning to. So write those down on a sheet of paper, and once you're ready, you can unpause the video and we'll continue on. Okay, everyone, thank you for doing that then. Hopefully you found that a little bit easier, maybe. I wouldn't imagine many people have grabbed anything that you can possibly see, but it can be something that you can see or something that you've just made up yourself. Now, one thing that's really important with the narrative thread is it does have to be really, really meaningful. So you have to give a reason why you're starting your story with this and why your character keeps returning to the thought of it. It can be first person, third person, but either way, your character has to continue to return to it for some reason. So they do have to have a personal connection to it. And what I would like you to do again once I finish speaking is using those 5 ideas that you've come up with based on that image. Rewind the video if you need to look back to it. Write down next to those or just after them why each of those items or things has some sort of sentimental or personal value to your main character. So why do they really feel connected with that item? So for example, I've come up with the idea of maybe the old woman in the house, she could have a chipped teacup. And that's what I would keep returning to. So my idea for the story would be something like the cup was a wedding present that the old woman was given from her parents on her wedding day. But sadly now her husband's passed away and so have her parents, because she's obviously a little bit older. And this is now the only thing that she's got in her possession that connects her with both her husband and her family as well. So she can kind of keep clinging on to that, and that would be her narrative thread to maybe help bleed in some memories of childhood or a early relationship with her husband, later relationship with her husband, and things like that. So just pause and write down similar ideas. What could the story be behind each of your different ideas for your narrative thread? Okay, everyone, thank you again for having a go at that. Hopefully, with this as well, when you've been having to think about that, you've started to think about maybe how your story could evolve from introducing these smaller items. You would only have one, but it's given you some sort of idea of the sort of story you could tell, but a nice small scale story. Now, finally, what we need to think about is how to kind of begin and end with this different narrative thread. So, obviously, I've already said that your first paragraph should be your description where you introduce this narrative thread and it should bleed through. And I mentioned at the beginning that you can bookend the story, so start and end in some way with your narrative thread. So it could be that your character does something with it or things like that. So you should, I have said in each paragraph you need to reference your narrative thread in a small way, and small is important. Don't make it the kind of huge focus of the story. Other things do need to be going on. So what I would like you to do, again, once I've finished speaking, if you just pause the video, and I want you to pick out this time just one of the items that you've identified as a possible starting point in narrative thread from the picture of the woman in the house, and think about how your story could begin and end with your narrative thread, and just jot down in your notes that you've been making how it could start and how the story could conclude with that narrative thread to kind of close things off. So just for one of the items, not all five. If you want to do all five, please feel free to challenge yourself a little. Okay, thank you again, everyone, for having a go at that. So this is just me finishing off, closing up by just talking about what you do need to think about in terms of your creative writing. Now, I mentioned at the start that you don't have a lot of time to write this, and in terms of coming up with these big fight sequences where people have got guns and there's explosions going off and murder and things like that. I do understand that a lot of people will want to write those big, exciting stories like that, and if that's where you're going at the minute, that's fine, but you really do need to think about scaling things down because you have not got time to go into detail about those events or something like that. So what I've got is an optional extra for people who at the minute are thinking about those big grand stories like that. I've taken one idea, so this idea of an explosion going off or a bomb going off or something like that, and I've scaled it down and introduced a narrative thread into that story to help you think about how you can focus on this small detail and use this idea, but crop it down so it's just a moment rather than this big kind of extreme action sequence or something like that. So I've taken the idea, like I say, of a bomb going off or an explosion, and I've thought about this idea that the narrator or the main person in the story could have a grenade pin as their narrative thread. So they've just got a hold of that, not the whole grenade, just the pin that's come from it to allow it to blow up. And in my story, I was thinking if this is the narrative thread, they have a grenade pin in their hand. They're just thinking back to the moment when they threw it and they felt a need to keep a hold of this grenade pin after they've thrown it. And they've kept a hold of it because they have had to use it in war. However, they didn't throw it correctly and it didn't go far enough, and therefore they've ended up killing one of their own men. So they really, really feel guilty about that. However, at the end of the story, they're trying to bury their grief and their guilt by burying the pin somewhere in their garden, or they could even be burying it on top of the grave where the soldier that they killed was there. So the story wouldn't have to talk about the big explosion itself. It wouldn't have to talk about the war. It's just really connecting with that person who has the pain, their emotions, their feelings, rather than focusing on the big event itself. So that's just an idea of how you could possibly scale down, but still keep some ideas if you have previously been thinking about these big grand stories of explosions and fight sequences and things like that. This is my kind of final sign off for the narrative thread. And I think this is something to really, really consider, considering you know that you obviously have creative writing coming up. That's your assessment point A for the next couple of weeks once we get back after the holidays. excuse me, and this is really my advice to you. So it is very, very unlikely, as I've previously said, that you're going to get an image that is as detailed as the one I've given you to have a look at today. And you might not have an image where you can pick out a tiny detail or anything like that as your narrative thread. So it's more than likely that you are going to have to make up your own narrative thread and imagine that there's this small item in the scene, or there's a character in the scene who's hiding this small item somewhere. However, you can use that completely to your advantage. So you can fully prepare a narrative thread in your head and write it out, memorize it for something that when you sit down to do your creative writing, you absolutely know that you're going to include in your story. So, for example, you can plan the idea of a character having a coin in their pocket or having a photograph in their purse or wallet, and you can think about why that's important to them, and you can tweak it to suit the different scenario that you're going to be asked to write about. So, it is important to remember that you likely will have to tweak it to suit the question a little bit, but it will save you so much time when it comes to sitting down and writing out your creative writing, because you already know, right, okay, I'm going to start off, this is my paragraph that I've already planned to describe this small feature, this narrative thread, and this is what I'm going to have the character do to continue to include it. And it's just really, really slight tweaking that you'll have to do to the item itself. Maybe it's the meaning behind um why this character has it and things like that. But so just think about that. You could spend time after this thinking about your narrative thread, plan it out, and then, like I say, just tweak it when it comes to your assessments. Hopefully everyone has found that quite helpful, and I do hope it has given you this idea of how to scale down your stories and really focus in on things. And again, one just final reminder, it is really this small snapshot moment in time that we're thinking about, and looking at how you describe that small moment rather than having this huge expansive story where all sorts of different things are happening. So really think about keeping your characters to a minimum, any events to a minimum, and really just focus on a really intimate kind of snapshot into one person's life or one or two people's lives.